I'm very conscious of the honour being bestowed by the Royal Society. Thank you. I'm grateful. I've been reminded of the architectural education and training I did in Japan. Next slide. This diagram shows the major figures in Japanese architecture and who worked for who going back to the 19th century. Diagrams like this show something fundamental about the way architects there think. Architects in Japan are very conscious of their place in history and see their role as picking up the concerns of the people they were taught and trained by and carrying them forward. Given who I studied under and worked for, I can locate myself within one of the streams of development in the diagram. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we'd recognise this in our personal lives as expressing our whakapapa, though this way of thinking isn't really part of our architectural culture. Next slide. So one of my early projects on returning to New Zealand was to put together and publish this kind of whakapapa diagram for local architecture. Like most Kiwi architects, I can locate myself in the lower branches of these lineages. Being elected fellow acknowledges and requires acknowledgement of these lineages. I think particularly of the groundbreaking acoustician Sir Harold Marshall, who was made a fellow of the Society in 1994, at about the time I was a pimply undergrad sitting in his classes at the University of Auckland. So that's the past. I want to show you a little of our current thinking by talking about a couple of things. One a specific project and the other a vague mission. Next slide. This is Cathedral Grammar School, a classroom block built after the quakes in Christchurch, which I designed with old friends from Tokyo days, Tezuka Architects. It made innovative use of engineered timber and prefabrication, which are increasingly important aspects of our New Zealand construction industry. The parts of the structure were fabricated in Auckland on a huge imported machine, and in some ways the Cathedral Grammar project just caught New Zealand up to what is happening abroad. But one of the unique things we achieved in this building was very tight tolerances for the timber structure. Where in previous local timber structures, you could put your fingers into the joints. Here we got within 0.5 millimetre across pieces of timber 12 metres long. So very, very tight. These high tolerances meant that steel connectors weren't needed in most of the joints. Steel is expensive and slow to assemble, so getting unusually tight tolerances out of the fabrication machines allowed us to make the building simpler and cheaper than it otherwise might have been. This points to a key issue for New Zealand. Next slide. Other developed economies are large and very much interlinked. You can easily take advantage of materials and technologies and skills from across a wide area. A tree can be cut in one country, milled in a second country, and inserted into a building in a third country. By contrast, we're a small nation located far from almost everywhere. With bulky stuff like building materials, we must rely mostly on what we can do locally. As architects, our constraint is that of a modest economy. We must find ways of doing things ourselves within our small market and with our available technology. If we want to innovate, we have to try and do it by making things simpler rather than more complicated. In New Zealand, we have just a few of those large computer-driven milling machines for making big timber elements, such as the beams and columns from Cathedral Grammar School, but widely available small milling machines for cutting sheet materials into cabinets and small timber items. But we have little in between. There's a gap in the technological spectrum. Next slide. So with the students at the University of Auckland, we set about filling it, working on ways to hack the small machine so we could efficiently make mid-sized timber elements. This involves, amongst other things, making jigs so that we can quickly and accurately process the timber. We were invited to showcase this work at the most recent Venice Biennale. We wanted to make a seamless, non-orthogonal structure, but when you try and do this, strange things happen at the corners, often requiring complex and odd-looking joints. Next slide. Our solution was not to fold the structure around the form, but to consider the structure as three-dimensional from the outset. Next slide. This means the corners become very simple and can be resolved with basic joints. Next slide. We also hid symmetries within the geometry, so the number of different timber profiles and joints was cut in half. Every decision made it easier to build, but not less innovative. This is the result. Next slide. Next slide. In New Zealand, timber is the most common building material, and we have huge forests to supply our needs. We can use this timber both to create high quality architecture and to reduce our carbon footprint. But where others might seek to drive up the technological spectrum, within our modest economy, the trick may be to make things simpler rather than more complicated. Now to talk about the vague mission. Next slide. I'm part of the generation that has gone from attending barbecues where we watched our parents drink wine from a cardboard box to attending barbecues where we watch our children choose from 3 reds depending on what kind of sausage they're eating. There's a lot tangled up in that, from the transformation of the wine industry to the sophistication of consumer tastes. But the upshot is that Kiwis have become much more discerning about what they put in their mouths at barbecues and much more literate about wine. However, there are big chunks of New Zealand culture that haven't evolved with anything like the same speed. Architecture is one of them. I'm part of a group of historians at the School of Architecture and Planning called the History and Theory Hub. We do the typical kinds of scholarly work, but have also taken on the wildly optimistic mission of increasing New Zealand's architectural literacy. This has us creating accessible resources that all sorts of people, whether it's working architects, design fans, people commissioning buildings, or high school kids writing assignments, can use to improve their understanding of both the history and the current state of play in architecture. Next slide. We've published maps of the architecture in particular cities and regions, as well as short guides that look at the work of a particular architect, or the evolution of a particular building type, or the architecture of a given city or town. Next slide. Our expectation is that people might print these to carry as they wander around town, but they include abbreviated references and notes on sources so that anyone who's keen can head to the library and investigate more deeply. We're up to nearly 100 of these publications, and they show up all over the place. Next slide. From being quoted in academic research to being handed out by real estate agents at open homes. Next slide. Coming back to the notion of literacy, all of this work is based on a fairly simple premise that, as with wine, if people have a sense of what good is, they'll seek it out. They'll also encourage the investments of money and care that make good possible, whether that investment is made by them personally or by the institutions that serve them. Now, there aren't many ways in which a building is like a bottle of wine, and bashing out maps and illustrated guides might seem a hopelessly trivial endeavour, particularly given the scale and urgency of challenges such as the climate emergency. But we see this work as a contribution to our architectural culture, which is part of our culture in Aotearoa New Zealand, more generally. Any improvement here will aid our ability to communicate and as a society to work through the trickier questions that surround our built environment. The projects we've done in timber are in many ways prototypes or demonstrations. They can move the needle, but only a little at a time. If we can boost literacy so that more people are saying, I'd like some of that too, then we might begin to see the kind of change we need. Okay, that's enough. Many thanks again to the Royal Society Te Apara.